Welcome to episode 8 of the Belief Books podcast. If you're new to the podcast, I'm Josh Naiman. I'm having conversations with all sorts of people, awesome people, about climate change denial, faith, science, technology, society, culture, you name it. And at the end of each year, I'll publish these conversations as a book. For this episode, I want to set it up well because I think the story is worth mentioning, and I really enjoyed this interview. It all started with one phone call, well, a series of phone calls and emails to a lot of different people, but I can trace back to one specific call with a really nice woman from an organization out in California. And at the time, she couldn't do an interview, but was really nice and willing to talk to me for a while and offer some suggestions, and had mentioned that I should reach out to farmers' bureaus. And I hadn't thought of that, and I've been reaching out to a lot of people at this point. So I did just that after our conversation, and that was when the domino effect really spun out of control, in a really good way. I contacted all surrounding states of Indiana, that's where I'm in, and I contacted their farmers' bureaus. Only Michigan got back to me. They put me in touch with Jim Nugent, who I interviewed, and I'll publish that interview really soon. He's an awesome guy, a cherry grower there in Traverse City, and he had me over to his farm. It was awesome. But Jim put me in touch with Dave. So I called Dave, this guy, David Barrons. He seemed really interested in what I was doing and agreed to an interview, and so I told him some more about my plans, and I told him that I planned to stay overnight and camp if the weather was good. And he said, do you have 5 minutes? Can I call you back? Let me talk to my wife. I'll call you back. So I said, okay. He called me back, and he had to talk to his wife because he wanted to invite me to stay with him and his wife at their home in Traverse City, Michigan. So I, of course, took him up on this really generous offer, and I figured I'd ask him if he drank any beer, and he did. And so I ended up bringing some Soul Ride, which is by Fountain Square Brewing Company here in Indianapolis. I thought that was appropriate to bring to him in Michigan, so that fueled our conversation. So the time came last April to go on my Michigan tour, to go up there to travel to Jim and Dave and some of the other guests that I've had on the podcast already, and some that you'll hear and meet soon. But because I had to set up all those other interviews, I decided that I'll just drive up there early, stay the night, so that I'm not late to anything, that nothing goes wrong, and if something goes wrong, I have plenty of time to take care of it. So I ended up actually staying at a gas station nearby, and I just figured I'd save some money and sleep in my car because I wasn't going to sleep well anyways. And I didn't, not because I was in the back of my Volkswagen Jetta, but because I couldn't stop thinking about all the questions that I was going to ask all these amazing people over the next 2 days. I was excited to meet all of them and learn a lot from them. I knew I would, and they all seemed so cool when I talked to them beforehand. So I went to bed, eventually. Morning came, and I got to Jim's beautiful farm right on time, had a great interview, a wonderful lunch with this amazingly delicious cider beer that he recommended from the apples that grew right there in the area. And then after that, I made it over to Dave's, who Jim had recommended I meet with.
Everybody sees the oceans rising, they're kind of worried, they still don't believe it. Big, massive hurricane comes in, floods the whole city, does a lot of other damage too, but the water doesn't leave. There is no future to go back to. I think it'll be that kind of catastrophe before we move the reticent brains.
That's Dave Barrons, former meteorologist and weatherman from Traverse City, Michigan, and a super nice guy. In the living room of his very nice and reasonably sized home, we had a really great and enlightening conversation while drinking our Soul Rides. We talk about wacky weather and the transfer of heat, the consequences of climate change and what we can do to mitigate that change, climate versus weather, our deep connection to agriculture and farmers, the reasons for climate change denial and his encounters with some deniers, the power of science, celebrities and human waste, the law of thermodynamics, Daoism, the Quagga Mussel, planting trees, fossil fuels and the importance of energy and its grid, batteries, cars, freedom and the American lifestyle, philosophy and economics, his advice for seeking the truth, and what it would take to change his mind that the climate is changing. All of this in an hour-and-a-half long interview, and I learned a lot in this one, as usual, but I really felt connected with what he was saying and how he felt and what he knows. So he has a lot to share with you. I think you'll like it. Enjoy.
We have changed the chemical composition of one of the two principal heat transfer fluids involved in the weather machine, the thermodynamics of weather. And there are two heat transfer fluids involved. Water, the oceans. That's one of the things we've really learned over the last 40 years now, putting a lot more research into. The oceans are part of our weather. How the oceans release their heat. Weather's all about moving heat. How the oceans move their heat and give it off into the air. Then how the air responds from that into its wind patterns and et cetera. That is what our weather is. So we've changed the composition of the other fluid heat transfer process, and that's the atmosphere. We've added CO2. In a high school physics lab, you can prove that CO2 holds heat. In a good, any decently funded and outfitted high school physics lab, CO2 holds heat, captures heat, re-releases it, but it holds it. So it's insulation in the atmosphere. You can prove that in a high school physics lab. And we've done that to the atmosphere. We've changed the chemistry of this heat transfer fluid tremendously. And that's why I believe that climate is changing and will continue to change, et cetera. There's no way around it. We're heating up a heat-moving system. It's going to be different.
How do we then mitigate it? So there's no getting around it. What do we do about it? Is there something we can do about it, or is it too late? Are we screwed?
Well, you've dived right to the bottom of any environmental question, because at the bottom has to be a recognition that there are just a lot of us two-legged critters walking around the planet. We're 7.4 billion right now, I believe, in this April of 2017. Somewhere around that. We're above 7 billion of us. We invented machines, which means the footprint that each one of us leaves on this planet has expanded by the power of machines. There are just too many of us, so what can we do about it? The answer is long-term. It's going to take a long time to do some things about it right now, not only because there are just a lot of people, and so we're talking about an answer that includes fewer people, which becomes political instantly and religious and everything else. Also because carbon dioxide in the atmosphere lasts a long, long time. And I believe we've increased the density of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to such a degree it will take a couple of centuries minimum to reduce the levels back down to something we know now. So climate change is happening. There are things we can do. They will prevent the extreme consequence. But can we avoid some consequence? No, we've gone beyond that point. There's going to be consequence to the fact that we've put a lot more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's already happening. First thing that happens is wacky weather. That is weather. And why is this important? Wacky weather is important as a consequence of climate change because farmers then can't count on the weather. Now farmers tell me, well, we've never been able to count on the weather, Dave. Every spring it's a hopeful, I hope this weather's good. I hope it's a good season. That's true. Farmers have never been able to count on the weather, but they have been able to count on the climate. That's why they grow tobacco in North Carolina and cherries in Traverse City. We have a fruit belt here. We can't grow tobacco. North Carolina, historically, was good for tobacco. I mean, there are climate areas where some crops grow better than others. Well, those climate areas exist because weather was that way over time. We have a fruit belt because Lake Michigan provides us a longer frost-free spell. The trees are safer from frost for a longer period of time because Lake Michigan keeps us warmer, especially in the spring. A little bit warmer, just enough. So we have a fruit belt. It's only about 15 miles wide. You come off Lake Michigan and get more than 15 to 25, 20 miles inland, and it'll shift what's grown on the farms. Maybe today, more to corn. But the fruit belt's very narrow along Lake Michigan because we could count on a longer frost-free period. No longer can we count on that. In fact, what we can perhaps count on is warming at the wrong time, wacky weather. Big warm-ups in February. Cherry trees wake up, some normal cold comes back in April and freezes everything. And the cherry trees have woken up, their buds have gotten swollen, and the freeze comes in and it destroys it. So farmers can't count on the weather anymore. It's always been the biggest risk for them, but they grew what they grew in part because the climate was right for that. And now, as we change the weather over time, we change the climate, and maybe we can't grow cherries here anymore, or maybe we can't grow something else in its location because things have changed. Most plants are going to really be more susceptible to water issues, but wacky weather we've never seen before, rising oceans, acidity in the ocean, and then excessive rainfall are my 4 first impacts of climate change. Excessive rainfall, if we raise the temperature of the planet 1 degree Celsius, which we've done, we increase the amount of water in the planet's atmosphere at any one time by 5%. Why are we having greater floods, bigger floods? Floods more often in places that had never flooded quite like that before. The atmosphere is carrying pockets of much more moisture than ever before. That is, again, the general measure, 1 degree Celsius for the planet, 5% more water in the whole atmosphere. So we're building up these extremes of heat and moisture in the atmosphere that come out as more violent storms, but also heavy, heavy, intense rainfalls. So wacky weather, ocean rise, acidification of the ocean, which has massive impacts, and then flooding incidents, historic flooding incidents repeatedly in many places around the globe. Those are the big impacts that I think we're already seeing. I don't think this is in the future. Those things are already happening. I'm not sure they register for everybody yet, but I think they will become steady enough and more frequent they will register.
How could, because this has been a common theme, how can you get people to have that register? I can't see the climate changing. I don't notice that. I'm not a cherry farmer. Maybe scientists or anybody. How can we get people to understand that the climate is changing? What's the disconnect there?
Ooh, 2 different questions.
Yeah, that's true.
How do we fix it, and how did it break in the first place? What's the disconnect? So what is the disconnect between those who really just don't see climate change as either happening or a threat, and those that do? One reason we disconnect, some people disconnect, is some distrust of science, and I think some recognition that, oh, climate change, I just read about it, and the threats were horrible, the outcomes were horrible. I can't deal with that. And I think, for example, some in agriculture, some farmers, have a really tough life and a real struggle every day with just the weather, let alone the climate. And all the issues, that something that big, something as threatening as climate change really is, have to go to some sort of denial or some sort of bargaining. I'm borrowing terms from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of death and dying. I think we go through some of that when we confront climate change. It's a huge threat to us. And those who see the threat and accept it as a real threat get scared. And I think a lot of people, no, I can't do that. I can't deal with that. That's just, that's beyond the scope of my lifetime. I can't. I don't need to deal with that. And I don't blame people so much for feeling that way, because those that I've run into who feel that way, their livelihoods are dependent upon the way things used to be. And to come to some recognition that it's not going to be the way it used to be in the weather department is an existential threat, in a sense, to certain people. I mean, certain occupations, maybe. And so I think there's a certain simple denial, and then maybe some bargaining to say, well, okay, I know technology is going to save us, so I don't have to worry about it. We got a lot of good people working on this, and it'll take care of us. I do think, and I've run into this from reactions in audiences I've spoken to, that there is some mistrust of science, some lack of understanding of a couple of things. One, that science can be so simple that in a high school, I mean, the science of science of climate change can be so simple as to prove it in a high school physics lab. That is, that CO2 absorbs heat, it holds it, re-releases it. And I don't think a lot of people accept the power of science to study things that are really difficult, and in the case of climate, it's through proxy measures. That is, when we bore the ice core and say, we can see 400,000 years of climate because we study isotopes of oxygen and and people go, what? No, you don't know 400,000 years of climate. You can't, science can't do that. I think there's a percentage of people out there who don't get the power of science, which is the power to actually learn things, to learn things we don't know. Now, this is interesting. Where does Christianity stand in a part of that particular point that I just made? On the one hand, and I've gone through this with all kinds of circumstances, experts and general public who I've had conversations. In Christianity, God put us on the earth to have dominance over the earth, to use the earth for the benefit of us. What all does that mean? And there's a split between a sense, I have heard people just in the past year, in one audience at least, say to me, this can't be. Humans can't do this. They're not powerful enough to do this to the atmosphere. Humans can't be changing the climate because God didn't make it that way. God made it for us to be able to use this planet. And we're doing good things. We're using it. We're doing good things. So God's not on your side. On the other side, oh no, God's on my side because he said we have to take care of this place. And there's a split in Christianity, I think, between those who say we get to use it, our habitat, our little speck of dust that we live on, to our benefit, or a recognition, no, God created it all and we're responsible for taking care of it as he created it, she created it. Getting lost in political correctness is difficult.
And don't worry about that.
No.
But yeah, absolutely. It's interesting though, you would think that either way that someone says, going on the Christianity thread, or any religious thread, is that they're thinking about their children. Their children are very important, and their children's children, and how they leave the earth, because what they do now is affecting their children and their children's children. You think that that'd be on the forefront.
Part of my answer to you, Josh, about how do we change things, however you ask it, I don't know. Because I have not come up with a way to talk to someone who really doesn't like what I'm hearing. I've had experiences where that's, even one where the person came up to me and that person said, I don't know anything about climate, I don't read about it, but I know this is all natural. And then he actually physically touched me, poked me in the chest like this, and said, the problem with people like you is you just talk as if you know everything, you know it all. And in fact, a second time when I had a real big interruption, didn't interrupt, but when I first got to Q&A, this person stood up, took over a very large meeting and said essentially the same thing, that I had expressed myself as being a know-it-all and everyone who didn't agree with me was stupid. Now, Josh, I can tell you in the presentation, I never got close. I didn't think. Nowhere in what I said did I ever sense that I was implying that people were stupid if they disagreed with me. I felt like I sort of bent over backwards. And yet in that was an honest reaction. So honest that he picked up his briefcase and stormed out of the meeting. I mean, he felt strongly that I had said he was stupid because he disagreed with me. And of course I didn't say those words, but the whole discussion led him to feel that way. So I don't know how to get through to someone like that. This was a person who I know didn't deny science because he was an agriculturalist. He was a grower. He relied on science in so many ways. I'll bet he had sensors in his orchards that read daily reports of either pests or weather from Michigan State directly out of East Lansing. I mean, he believed in science. He had to in order to live in the business he lived in. But somehow my presenting of the science as I understood it, and the presenting of one single graphic from Jim Hansen, former director of the Goddard Space Center, who testified in '88 in front of Congress and is so famous in the whole climate debate. His 2010, I think it was updated 2012, his chart of what's happened to actual high temperature records in North America, in the Northern Hemisphere, between 1980, 3 decades, and 2010. You can see the graph begins with a normal bell curve, the normal of the previous weather records. Put high temperature records into a normal bell curve, and you see some of them are out at I don't know, I can't recall it technically off the top of my head, but 1.5 standard deviations off the norm or something would be some extremes on that. What's happened in 30 years, you watch the red, the hot, on his graph move. These are the recorded temperatures. This is not a model. This is actually what happened, 1980 to 2010. The actual recorded temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere just shifted into the hot side more and more and more until we get to the point where some of our extreme 1 point whatever standard deviations off the norm back then are going to become the norm for now, or are becoming the norm. And extreme records are 3.5, 4 degree standard deviations off the norm. Well, that's a pretty potent image. I think it's the best image of what climate change means. We're getting hotter. And you can see the graph move. This is what actually happened in 30 years. We got this much warmer. And the extreme warmth was really extreme. I showed that graph. I said what I said about high school physics, and this poor person felt that I was saying he was dumb. I don't know how to get beyond that. I mean, I have not come up with any magic way of response.
I think if it was easier, it'd be done. But I think what the disconnect might be, I've thought about this a lot, is science, number one, is really, really difficult. So scientists are immersed in this very difficult realm in a person who's, say, a basketball player, or, there's nothing wrong with that. But in order to know what a scientist knows, you have to go through all the studying that a scientist knows. So it's, number one, very difficult stuff. Number two is scientists aren't always the best communicators, it seems like. So there's extra barriers, even though it's happening, how to get it in front of people and get people to realize that's like extra hurdles, it seems.
You're making me think, okay, how does a Jim Hansen, so I'm just picking that name because it's a Bill McKibben, a big voice in the environmental, the climate action side, that we've got a problem. Maybe the answer to our question, how do you get through, is as a strategic model, you make it clear you're going to become a celebrity in your effort. Celebrity status attracts so much. One of my favorite sayings right now, Americans know much more about celebrity than they do history. Celebrity status is infecting so much of the atmosphere in which we live. Maybe the answer to climate change is some sort of celebrity status. I have no answer to what that means, but somehow we need a voice. Well, the polar bear became a celebrity for a bit. Americans love cuddly animals, cute pictures of cuddly animals. The polar bear became a bigger public relations hit for the climate change activists than a lot of other things they've tried, just because it was cuddly, etc. Maybe we need more emphasis on what we're doing to the rest of the skin of the planet. Climate change is caused by humans not fully managing and cleaning up their own waste stream. One way or another, human civilizations pollute the groundwater or the air. And you can trust me in saying one way or another, because just think about it. If we bury stuff in the ground and it decays, well, okay, still all the stuff that we made that's part of that decay, let's say it's plastic or whatever, where does it go? It goes down in the ground. Where does it end up? In water. Once it's in water, it's held there It flows around. It doesn't go through that and keep on going down into the ground and somehow be burned up by the earth. It gets into the water. Or in our waste stream, we have things that are either gas themselves, like the exhaust out of our car, right at the tailpipe, or things we make that turn into gas, which happens in lots of different things. So where does that waste go? Product that we didn't mean to get there, but it got there, so it's waste, because it came from some other use. It goes to the atmosphere or goes to the water. We have to clean up our waste stream. And I forgot the exact question I'm trying to answer with that point, but the point remains, humans need to come to grips with cleaning up their waste stream in a totality way. Because there are too many of us. We use machines that increase our impact monstrously, and we're dirtying the very place we live in.
It seems like it's going to take a fundamental change of the root of how we run a lot in our lives, like the machines as well as our habits. It's an entire shift.
I don't know that we will do it by design or plan or social political movement until after we suffer some big, well, maybe the catastrophe won't be a single big one, let's say like Katrina, but maybe it'll be 6 Katrinas in a row. Maybe it'll be the 10-year drought of California, so important to our food production, moving to a 10-year drought in the Great Plains, into the central Midwest. Well, that may not hit our food chain quite the way California does, but it would hurt the supply of our animal feeds, a lot of our chemical stock, corn syrups, all kinds of things we do use out of the great grain lands of Central America, Central U.S. Somewhere, some big catastrophe might be the only thing that moves that final 30% of the population that says, nothing's going wrong. We don't need to do anything. It's going to cost us money if we do anything. So I don't want to spend any more money. I don't know what'll move them. But then isn't that kind of the problem we face all the time in a political democracy? Is it takes time to move the opposition, always.
I had a conversation with an organization when I went out to New York, and a guy brought up a really good point that it's like what smoking is, that people deny that, it's not that big of a deal. They keep smoking until they go to the doctor, you have cancer. And then, now I realize it's a problem.
Well, it isn't human nature like that. I mean, we see it in other ways too. We could probably sit and think for a few minutes and come up with multiple other examples. And I'm afraid it's the same and with the threat that climate change is, or the recognition that it's happening now. I think part of the difficulty for a whole lot of the population is that we haven't hit the proof, the real final diagnosis that, oh my God, you're sick and you're going to lose 30% of your shoreline in the next 3 years. You're going to have to move 80 million people in the next 3 years to a new place. Miami's going to be gone by next September. You know, you better move. I don't know. It seems like it might take something, impact like that, to move a whole lot of contrary opinion.
The climate is changing. Extreme weather is disrupting livelihoods and food supplies around the world. This is observed. This is documented. This is the scientific community's consensus. The climate is changing. Carbon emissions are driving that change. Emissions come from burning fossil fuels. So if we want to slow or even reverse the change, we must lower our fossil fuel use. By charging a fee on fossil fuels and returning that revenue to households as a dividend, we can do just that, starting a chain of positive effects. Fossil fuels become less desirable. Cleaner sources of energy become more competitive. The dividend creates millions of jobs. Carbon emissions go down, reduced air pollution saves tens of thousands of lives, and climate change is brought under control. We can make this happen, but enacting a carbon fee and dividend isn't in our hands, it's in theirs. How do we sway them? What can we do? We can use our voices to express political will and demand action. We must help our elected leaders work together. It's on us to tell them what we want as a group. Because when voices call out together, their impact multiplies. Government can respond to the will of the people, provided we tell the government what we want. And what we want is a livable world. This is what Citizens Climate Lobby works for: to empower citizens to connect with and influence their members of Congress, to spread the idea that each one of us can address climate change. Bring your voice to citizensclimatelobby.org.
I worry about our ability going into the near-term future in gaining enough support to do even more to mitigate climate change. So much of our younger generations don't have a lot of experience with nature. More of us live in urban areas. More of us, I'm afraid that many human beings have the sense we've overcome nature. After all, we have refrigeration, air conditioning. I mean, to live in the tropics used to be, not long ago, not more than decades ago, a real struggle because of the heat and the bugs and other things too. But air conditioning revolutionized the condition of human existence on the planet. We've lifted men off the planet of the Earth, overcome gravity, and sent them to the moon. Those we got indoor hot water. For God's sake, we've overcome nature. You know, we can literally dominate nature. Well, no, we can't. Nature's run in part by the laws of thermodynamics, and the fact that we could throw a man up to the moon didn't mean we overcame the laws of gravity. It meant we put enough energy into the effort, and it got us over gravity because the energy won that equation. But somewhere the laws of nature and thermodynamics will rule. I don't know, humans have always had a connection to the planet around them. And as we urbanize, as we go into a whole life that's existing on screens, you know, if I had my mobile device, I'd hold it instead of my hand. But I see so many people, and this isn't a criticism exactly at all, because these are great tools. But the smartphone, the tablet, the whole existence in the world of the screen does not tie us to nature. And we have not overcome nature. Nature's laws are immutable. Some point, we can force them to bend. We can punch through gravity if we put enough energy to it, enough punch in the rocket engine. But we didn't break the laws. We didn't overcome the laws. We still had to follow them. And those laws will come back as we push and it shoves back. And I think there are a lot of people that don't get that. They have a nature deficit. They aren't connected to how we're connected to the planet. I mean, I've heard stories that, yeah, some inner city kids, where do eggs come from? And they'll say the grocery store, meaning they don't know that they come from chickens or that they're laid by birds. I don't know if that's really true, but it's that kind of thought that we really don't get how we're still tied to the physical processes, the living, breathing, pumping organism that is the planet Earth, that somehow we breathe that. We're the critter who came along and beat that. Well, no, we didn't. No, we didn't. We may not learn it until we have a catastrophe of some sort. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that we're way more disconnected than we have been. And that disconnect is even the thing that's fueling the change in a big way.
And the disconnect is part of what I was suggesting, is part of the hurdle standing in the way of making change. Because we need public push. We need concern amongst all kinds of people if we're going to move a political culture that is still lagging behind. And if we don't have people who get it, that we're still very much tied to the ecosystem services, to use a highfalutin term. A lot of people don't get that good forests produce clean air, that good tree cover, land cover in many places prevents floods, that good shoreline protection with mangroves prevents loss of shoreline along the ocean. A lot of people just don't get that we're still connected to the place we live that way. And I think we've lost it through an ever more blossoming technology age that allows us to live without that stuff. We can turn on the air conditioning, the central heating, whatever, and nature doesn't bug us.
Yeah, yet this technology is, there's somewhere in lies the solution. In fact, why I was in New York is I was talking to this organization who's 2 months old, and they developed because they want to support this scientist on their own. And the scientist had come up with a way to take CO2 out of the air and create nanofibers, carbon nanotubes from that. So it holds the carbon and then releases the oxygen. So all you're left, you can do it in a coffee mug, apparently. Not only that it sucks the issue out of the air, but then it produces something that we can use for plastics.
Oh, I find this to be an extremely Taoist solution.
Can you say more about that?
Yes. In Daoism, one would learn that, well, this has been said in lots of different ways, but I like to quote, the Taoist point of view on this is very simple. An existence strength is also its weakness. Well, if we're facing this buildup of carbon as a real threat in the atmosphere, well, then in a way, if that's the enemy, then its weakness is that there's a lot of it. And so let's use it. The idea that we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere and actually make something out of it instead of just sequestering it in the ground, I've not heard, that's fascinating. That's a great solution. You know, and in the same way, we have an environmental problem here in the Great Lakes with the Quagga Mussel, an invasive species of little mussel, about yay big. Lots of people may have heard of the Zebra Mussel. This is the bigger cousin. It can live in colder water and deeper water than the zebra, so it's taken over the Great Lakes. And I have seen underwater photography from a robot submarine showing, I don't know, it's 4 or 5 feet thick bed of quagga mussels built on top of each other, almost like a reef sort of structure, that lines the entire bottom between Muskegon, Michigan and Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and 90 miles. But a solid layer. Well, the whole bottom of Lake Michigan and all the Great Lakes are getting turned into this. The mussels are taking the food out of the food column, which is the absorbed energy of the sunlight, and turning it into their shells, the shells of these mussels. And it sits on the bottom of the ocean, so they're really draining the food value of the food column of Lake Michigan, like the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan in particular I'm talking about, and solidifying it on the bottom. Well, that's a horrible thing. We're losing all of this valuable resource tied up in seashells on the bottom of Lake Michigan. So in the future, certainly one solution has to think about, well, how do we use the seashells? What do we do with it? And there are all kinds of technical questions with that. But the whole idea of making nanofibers out of atmospheric carbon, that's fascinating. That is going to be part of what we have to do to repair the damage we've done. We've taken a system that was this way and we've made it this way. Well, we have to figure out how to use it if we're going to save ourselves and the whole system.
And the fascinating thing on top of that is that it's not only a solution, but it to the problem, but it makes something that we can use, and it attracts people that even you can deny that climate change is a thing, and it's still like, well, do you have a problem with us using air, the thin air, to make something? And so it's like, I was very fascinated by it, and it's really new, so I'll obviously keep you updated on it, and we now have a collaboration, which is cool. Their organization is called Climo, and the technology is called STEP. That's the acronym. Yeah, so it's Dr. Licht. I figured I'd bring that up to you because it's quite interesting. Are you doing anything, or do you know of anybody who's doing something to combat climate change? Or have you heard of any organizations or movements?
Certainly to the degree that tree planting, I mean, anything we can do to absorb carbon dioxide is helpful. So the movements in the cities, Chicago's planted 1 million trees in the last 4, 5, 6 years. I think New York City's even done more of that. Now I have another issue with that kind of tree planting, but that's a different issue right now. In terms of carbon absorption, I mean, the efforts to absorb carbon through tree planting and all of that, that's all good. That's something I'm certainly aware of. I don't know of any other particular projects other than general things we hear about, the attempts to create clean coal, et cetera, et cetera. I think part of the answer to what can we do about it is we have to do everything, meaning solar. Well, reduction of fossil fuel. Fossil fuels is the culprit because it's so high in the carbon and That's not what's burned to make heat and water vapor in those fuels. It's a waste. And so we certainly have to learn how to reduce putting the carbon in, and that is everything we need to do to create energy other than fossil fuel. And the fossil fuel is important because, think about it, it's a fossil. It's very, very, very old. It hasn't been in our chemical atmospheric system for millions of years. That's why it's called fossil fuel. Now we two-legged creatures, because we made machines and we can eat up energy like mad, we've released all of this in 150 years that took millions of years to concentrate. It's been sitting squeezed in the skin of the earth for tens of millions of years. Well, all of it's tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years, to concentrate this much energy in the black goo and the black rock of the earth, the skin of the earth. And we just have let a whole bunch of it out real fast. We got to learn how to pull it back, but we have to learn how to produce the energy we need without the fossil fuels. That presents another entire range of challenges. We're kind of getting there if we can do batteries.
We'll get back to talking about batteries in just a little. I like to take a short break each episode to thank my supporters and listeners of the Belief Books, just like you. And I'm very grateful, to say the least, to have supporters so early on in my journey with the Belief Books. And I can continue to do this better and more in the future because of this support. Some of those funds will go towards me self-publishing the book that I release at the end of each year. So thank you so much to my official Patron listeners, who are Greg Naiman, Nana Naiman, and Eric Roche. To my wonderful readers, Meltem Yetis, Serdar Yetis, and Berk Yetis. And especially to my very generous publishers who will make the printing of those books a reality. Hyundai Naiman, Mark Naiman, Bill Marpom, Nectar Gems, Benjamin C. Stout Photography, Stand Wrap, the Come to the Table podcast, and Scott Severns. If you like what I'm doing, you can also support me for as little as $1 per month on Podbean's Patron program. You can find more information about how that works and what you get for being a supporter right there on Podbean or the support page of my website, which is thebeliefbooks.com.
Continuing for the next 10 years to see the same advance in battery life, battery technology, that we have seen over the past years. Now that's quite a challenge. We've seen battery technology, I'll go the graph this way for you, very steeply. We've been increasing the technology, the ability of batteries rapidly over the last 10 years. Should we keep that going in a straight line form for the next 10 years, we may go a long way to solving some of these problems. The question is, will we see the point of diminishing returns on that technological development before we get there? Are batteries really the answer? Well, only if we keep going and probably see some advances that we have no idea of yet. But if we can figure out the battery problem, we can store energy from solar panels and wind, which don't produce all the time. You can keep a coal fire going 24 hours a day, and you can generate the electricity can run down those wires out of the coal fire plant all the time at the volume needed. Wind and solar produce the problem of intermittency. We need to have a base load on our wires. It's like electrical systems are just like plumbing systems. You got to keep the pressure in there or they don't work. If I don't have pressure behind my sink faucet, I don't get water out. We've got to do the same with electricity. That's the problem with renewables. On the other hand, if batteries go, we'll solve that problem, which will go a long way towards solving some of the future climate problems of burning more and more fossil fuel. Again, climate change is happening, and there's not much we can do about what is happening. There is still lots of room to do something about what will happen. Even worse things happening farther into the future. But we've already done enough to the atmosphere, changing the chemistry of the atmosphere, that even within, I'm 69 years old. You're much less than that. Even within my lifetime, certainly within your lifetime, serious impacts will be visible in the climate, in the weather, from all this insulation we've thrown up into the atmosphere. That's already going to happen, but it could get even worse in the future if we don't really trim back our use of fossil fuels. Battery development, in terms of what's going to happen in the future, what can we do? Let's make sure we do the best batteries we can possibly create, because that will help solve some of the problems of how do we make electricity, how do we store it so we can deliver it in the right way, the right flow all the time. Coal and gasoline, fuel oil, black goo, they all do that. They have so much energy in them. I mean, this is one of the problems we face. The density of this black goo coming out of this, density of energy out of this oil that comes out of the skin of the earth, or the coal, is very high. Gasoline's almost a miracle product. It's almost like water. The universal solvent of water. Water is just a miracle. It expands when it freezes. There's almost nothing that does that. And it has to, or our lakes would be frozen permanently. Gasoline's almost that crazy because it's a liquid. You can move it around, put it in the gas tank, drive around. It's relatively safe. And it's dense in energy compared to solar or wind. So we have to store the solar and wind. Batteries are critical to our future. However, we go back to the problem. There are 7.4 billion of us crawling around the skin of the earth. And we're using too much. The biosystem of the earth just can't give us enough. So we're going to run into this problem of there are too many of us and we consume too much. We're going to have to consume less, and there are going to have to be fewer of us. That'll all happen after my lifetime, and I don't see the answers. Jimmy Carter said that we needed to cut back, we needed to, what's the word I'm looking for? We needed to sacrifice. Americans don't want to hear that from a politician. You know, he wore his cardigan sweater, tried to show that the heat was down when he had his version of the fireside talks of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt was on the radio. It's a little different, completely different, as a matter of fact. Then every human and every American listening to him could make up their own image. But Jimmy Carter said, we got to cut back, and he wore a cardigan, and he tried to show the image of a less luxurious lifestyle. Americans didn't want to hear that. So how we get across this message that life has to change. We have to do better, we have to be more efficient, meaning we have to give up some things that's not highly saleable to the American people. Now, if it can be shown to them that, well, but there's no reduction in lifestyle here, they'll go along with it. But the question is, can we really replace the automobile or the impact of the automobile? Buick had it as one of their sales lines now, I'd say 20 years ago. It's not just your car, it's your freedom. Well, I grew up with Dinah Shore singing, see the USA in your Chevrolet. America is asking you to come. This was the beginning of the whole idea of summer vacation, the car trip. Post-World War II, all of a sudden, a lot more people than ever before in any one place were becoming middle class, and they could drive around and see stuff. And we made it part of being an American. If we can get the whole renewable energy into batteries to store all the electricity that it can't produce all at once, but we want, so it can store it when it's good. And then we can use it to keep our lifestyle going. I think, well, this country may figure some of these things out. But I don't know how we convince Americans that we've kind of overshot the mark and we need to trend back a little. You've seen our house, it's small. That was on purpose. No, we had a small family. But there was still a very conscious decision not to build the mega house, whatever, mega mansion, I guess they call it, whatever. Americans like bigger, better, more. And if I've got a lot of this and it's really good, well, I want a lot of this that's also really good, whatever. That will have to change to some degree, but it'll be forced upon us if we don't accept it.
Just recently, I'm going to capitalize on that. I've been watching a lot of things and hearing people talk who are living very minimal lifestyles. And sure enough, and these are people who are very wealthy, plenty of money for stuff, and they realize at a certain point the material stuff is not what they need. So they minimize and slash, and sure enough, they're way happier. With a minimal, it's kind of a less is more kind of philosophy, but it seems to be a reality. There seems to be something to that. So I would completely agree with that, and I commend you for making that decision.
I don't know that we made this for exactly this reason. It's our style. We vacation in a place where for 2 weeks we live with bicycles only, no car. There's a traffic issue where we go. The bicycle is easier. But we also have found ourselves to be very happy. It's only 2 weeks, but living in this space and this community without the sense that, oh, we got to be on the road by 8 o'clock tomorrow to get to Disneyland or Yellowstone, or that we got to go, because we're on vacation. We got to go here, we got to go here, we got to go. And it's kind of the same sort of thing that we found, that living on a bicycle for a couple of weeks and having no urge, need, desire, or even ability to go off and keep going to the next site, the next site, the next site. No, it's just every day. You're going to go to the grocery store because you can't carry a whole lot on your bike, so every day it's a trip to market. And every day after doing, my wife likes the beach, I like to fish. We do those things in the morning, and then it's, well, where are we going to ride this afternoon? And it's that whole paring back has led to a lot of happiness. Just slowing down is nice. Now, that's a personal style. When I trout fish, I like fishing my home river. I don't care about going to every river until I find the fish biting. No, I like to fish my home. So it's personal style that I like to go slow that way. But we've gotten awful fast. We've gotten awful needy for more stuff in this country, and that's undisciplined and a bit of an overshot.
Sure, yeah. A lifestyle and consciousness shift that needs to happen. But I'm going to kind of reel it back one topic. Are you aware of what Elon Musk is doing with Tesla and his batteries? He wants to make a home battery?
Actually, no, not technically. In the general press, I follow Tesla. I know who the Tesla, Musk, a lot of Musk's ideas and the things he's doing. But I certainly know that he's engaged in advancing battery and electronics. It's fundamental to what he's doing. The home battery, no. Don't know.
He's developed tiles just like a normal roof tile, and those are solar panels, and then that transfers the energy to, now he's opened or working on opening a huge plant to create batteries that then hold the energy from a roof. So essentially, everybody's home, you could replace your roof and you're solid.
His are tiles?
Yeah, so it's like in all sorts of different designed tiles too, depending on how you want your roof to look. But it's a solar panel, and it absorbs energy, and then it stores it into this really efficient battery, which he uses in the Tesla cars. And there's such opportunity there, and it's kind of mind-boggling that, Exxon or these companies, I get why they don't, but there's so much untapped opportunity and tons of money to be had there.
Part of the problem is finance. How does an ordinary person like me finance? I redid this roof just long enough ago that it's still young. It's still a new roof. What if I decided in the next months that I owe it to myself to, I need to put on Tesla tiles up on my roof? Oh, it's going to cost this many thousands. I really think our energy producing and transmitting companies, because they're two different entities that are very important in that whole system that keeps us going. But I think energy-related industry, whether it's making it or transmitting it and then selling it, need to become banks. They need to use their financial size and acumen to provide to Americans the funds to redo our building stock. 40% of all of our energy in this country is used in our building stock. Now, compared to a wind farm of high tech, the big new ones and solar farms, compared to that, our building stock is ancient, wasteful. We're spending money, which I know the cost of solar is coming way down, but relatively speaking, the cost of our energy, non-fossil fuel energies, are expensive right now. And we're putting expensive energy with all of this renewable generation into cheap, old building stock, where we waste a lot of it. So I think our energy industry, broadly speaking, somehow has to begin to operate as a bank to help us all finance a better way to use our energy, so that we need less. We need less. We need to need less. That will take a cost of money on each of our parts to improve our homes, our buildings. I really think as a national strategy, the energy industries have to become the bank to help finance all of us through that.
Yeah. If I got the solar tiles, if I had a windmill in my backyard, Well, I might have extra energy so I could sell.
And of course, what's happening is across several states, including my own here, movements to allow the electric utilities to actually not, well, they'll have to buy it back, but they'll buy it at a much less rate than it cost you even to put it in. In other words, they're not supporting. There's a lot of movement from the standard utility and energy creation side of our economy to keep their advantage by making it disadvantageous for people to put in renewable sources. And now, there's some reasons for that. I've seen charts, I can't detail all of this, but the solar panel input in Los Angeles is causing havoc with the management of the flow of electricity through the wires. Again, electricity moving through the wires, it's called base load. It's like you can have water in your plumbing system and it could leak out, it could keep getting pumped in and leak out, but it's not going to come upstairs to your water faucet unless you got pressure. And you can't have pressure if you got gaps, big air bubbles. It's got to be solid, it's got to be steady. Electricity is the same way. You got to have a minimum flow constantly. Renewable energy presents a huge problem to our grid. I think another huge problem to our grid because it goes up and down. Its input goes up and down. How does the grid handle that? It's causing huge problems in Los Angeles because of the input of so many more solar panels and how solar panels produce at times when demand is different and you can't just turn them off and turn them on the way you can electricity out of a coal plant or a nuclear plant or some others. It's causing problems. So there's lots of problems with the grid, but I do think, again, I remember your question long ago, what do? We need to modernize our grid. We need to modernize our building structure to use energy better, and we need to modernize the way we transmit it. Part of that modernization means brains at every end. I've got to have a brain out here on the side of my house. My meter's smarter than it used to be, but it needs to be smart enough to know all kinds of things and make economic decisions for me. That is, when do I make electricity and when do I sell it back to the grid? All of that kind of stuff can be done. But we need a national policy to modernize the grid. How we use electricity it's very certainly as important as how we make it. And we're not using it in a modern, efficient way. I don't think we're moving towards as high-tech, efficient use of electricity in this country as we are moving towards high-tech, efficient production. But if we're going to produce super energy, let's use it in a super way, not in an old-fashioned way. Our grid is horrible. It's going to break. Our building stock is out of date. We need to upgrade those things. Certainly our future in the world of renewable resources absolutely demands a smart grid, a distribution system that's got brains at every point, reading all these things, saying, yep, go, nope, stop, go, stop. It's got to be making all these decisions. I have a friend who owns a ski resort. He's a chemical or electrical engineer. His ski resort's very modern in its use of electricity. One of the ways it's modern, the snow guns. We have to make snow here in northern Michigan to really count on it for a good long ski season. His snow gun reads not only the atmospheric conditions outside, right temperature, pressure. I don't know if the brain spins the gun for the right wind directions or not, but it could. It knows whether or not to add this additive that becomes a nucleus for making the artificial, well, they're not artificial snowflakes once they're made. It's real snow, it's real water, but it's made through a man-made process. Well, part of that involves maybe adding this nuclei for the ice crystal to form around. And that's in the form of, I think, a gas compound, I can't remember right now. But the other part of what the snow guns do is they read the cost of electricity on the grid, which changes really, if you know the technical parts of it. The cost of electricity on the grid to your house changes, I'll say minute by minute, maybe it's 3 minutes by 3 minutes, but it'll go up and down by a penny or 2 pennies. Ski resort pumps 70 million gallons of water a year. It's a lot of electricity. So whether it's 1 penny cheaper or not matters a lot. His snow guns turn on not only because the atmosphere is right, but because the cost of electricity is right. And then they'll turn off if their brain sees, oh, cost of electricity just jumped 2 cents. I'm going to shut off for 20 minutes. Oh, it went down 1 cent. I'm going to come back on. That's how smart our use of electricity can be. We're doing it with snow guns at ski resorts. Well, it's life or death for them, but so it is in our houses. So we need to use our energy better, and we need to be concerned about it in the same way we're concerned about how we produce it. We got into this without even me saying the entire discussion of climate change and the threats of it has to be tied to a fairly deep and knowledgeable discussion of energy. Energy is the uber product. It's in everything. There's a measure of energy in every single thing man has ever done. There's a measure of energy in his own muscle power hoeing the corn in the garden. But we need to recognize that that fundamental base consideration of energy, where are you going to get the energy to do this, has to be part of every discussion of climate change. Because we got ourselves here into this predicament where we've heated up the system and it's going wacky. We got there by burning fossil fuel, old dense fuels, and just not paying attention to our waste stream, pouring the carbon out into the atmosphere. So if we're going to correct it, we also have to be careful, because we did all that because the energy was good for us. The energy allowed us to create what we've created. If we're going to talk about changing the impact of our creations, we have to talk about the energy supply, the kind of energy, how we use it. And it has to be less fossil fuel, but it also is probably going to mean a reduction in energy supply. Therefore, we better be real good about how we use it. That is conservative. Use less. Use less, use less, use less. Any discussion of climate change mitigation has to be a discussion of energy supply. You can't avoid it. The density of fossil fuels that allowed us to get to this position of luxurious opulence, the density of that energy supply is different than renewables. Renewables are very different from that, and we really have to talk about energy availability if we talk about the realities of this is a little bit longer term future. This isn't about an individual making decisions right now, but we really have to figure out how our whole energy picture, because that's what led us, overshooting the use of fossil fuels has led us to this predicament. Energy is the uber product. You got to study energy flow through to get a handle on so much of this.
It's a fantastic point. Jeez, yeah.
I can't quote the numbers, I can't quote the science, but there's a philosopher of history, John Michael Greer, who has said in several pieces of his writing, he's pointed out that the density of our fossil fuels is a certain number of BTUs per square meter or some such, and that solar and wind produce a density that's much less than that. While we think of solar blasting the entire Earth and we hear these figures, there's enough energy coming into the Earth in one day from the sun to fuel human civilization needs for 100 years or some such. Yeah, well, that's a totality. It's not that every bit of that energy is usable for us to convert to electricity, and that in fact the density of energy input from the sun is much less than, say, gasoline and per square meter, whatever. And then there's a rule in ecological science that the complexity of a thermodynamic system is directly proportional to the density of the original energy input. So Greer takes that and goes on through discussion to point out renewable energy is a lot thinner in its, what we think of as renewable energy, wind, solar, where it's first made in the panel or in the blades going around and then in the generator. It's a lot less dense than a gallon of gasoline. Fossil fuels are miracles in that sense. They're really dense amounts of energy because they're millions of years old, compressed for millions of years, and they've been sitting there for millions of years, and they're really dense. Renewable energy isn't, and so we have to figure that out, and it's going to produce, again, the challenging situation where humans have to face consciously, oh, I need to make do with less. I need to make do with less.
Yeah, or make machines and things that don't need as much, make them more efficient, like almost like close to perpetual motion machines where you get something going for just a little and it keeps itself going with just a little.
That's why I say the development of batteries may be crucial in our history. The development of our ability to save electrons, electricity, may be crucial to our future because energy is so important to all of us, but because we are not going to be able to continue making it, getting it from such a dense source. It's all going to become less dense, much thinner input stream, so we have to use it better. This is part of what Greer points out. John Michael Greer, by the way, I think is the most important historian writing at the time, contemporary. Greer simply points out that we've been able to, as humans, experience the development of the luxury of the Western world. Again, we got hot water and we got air conditioning. It's a wonderful thing, and a real steady food supply. So I'm warm at night or I'm cool at night, and I got food all day long. As a basic living creature, that's pretty good. He points out that we've been able to do that because energy, even through the different spells of it, from wood to coal, really wood for a long period, to coal, an important slice of it, whale oil, about the time that whale oil, which was so critical to the lighting of our cities, was disappearing. Oil, the black goo out of the skin of the earth came along, and we were able to continue. The point is, what's the next source? And what does it take to develop it? And what does it take to get it? So much of our luxurious lifestyle, which has led to this overshoot, this use of too much fossil fuel, and we are now kind of heating ourselves up, so much of that has come in an atmosphere of very relatively cheap energy. We are using up the fossil fuels in the skin of the earth. They're finite. We will never use all of it because the last good bit of it, millions of gallons of oil, barrels of oil will stay in the ground because we can't afford to get it out. It's just cost more energy to get than it ever provides. Well, Greer says this is what's coming. We've had a luxurious period of 7,000 years of human existence where the energy we needed was relatively abundant and cheap at the time we needed it. We're coming to the end of that stretch, unless perhaps batteries solve the problem or some other technical thing. But no longer in the skin of the earth is there going to be enough to give us free or cheap, abundant energy. And all that we've done has really come, as he argues, from this abundance, excess of relatively easy to get, cheap energy. And that era is coming to the end. Even if energy is relatively abundant, it ain't going to be cheap. And it's going to take a lot more of that energy to get the next barrel of energy. Figures, and I use this, Greer uses it all the time. When we first poked a hole in the skin of the earth in Pennsylvania, wherever that was, and came up with the first oil well in the US anyway, it took the energy of 1 barrel of oil to drill that hole and to get the oil flowing again. What did we get for the expenditure of 1 barrel of oil? 100 barrels. Worldwide, the average right now is we get 17 barrels for every 1 we expend. The tar sands in Canada, this is the EROI, the energy return on energy invested, EROI. I call it EROI. Tar sands are somewhere around 3.84 barrels of energy for every 1 we expend. We picked all the heavy fruit, easy fruit. You know, we used to get gushers. When I was a kid, there were movies made about gushers. Poke a hole in the skin of the earth in Texas looking for oil, and you not only found it, but you found it was liquid right in a pool under the skin of the earth, just not very far under the skin of the earth, and it was under pressure and it shot off. I don't know that gushers happen anymore in the oil industry. Not in the way they used to. Why? Well, we got all the good liquid, easy stuff sitting up close to the skin of the earth. Now we got to dig deeper. We have to, as they have to do in Saudi Arabia, and that entire oil field, they have to pump in water. It's under a big salt dome, the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. And they're pumping water in underneath to keep squeezing the harder bits to get up towards the top of the dome where we pull it out. When they first poked holes in the ground, they got it out all over the place. Now we have to do this extreme measure. It takes more and more energy to get a little bit. And again, the worldwide right now, the last I read, and this could be slightly inaccurate, 17 barrels returned for every 1 barrel we expend. And it's not sustainable. That will go away because at some point it will become 1 for 1. And why would you give me $10 million to get $10 million back, maybe 10 years from now? Because you really hope to give me 10 and get 100. And that's kind of the market that we've been in. Put in some money, and boy, in the energy business, you can get a lot back. That's going away. That's going away. The energy return on energy invested in the broader energy picture on this planet is going down. It takes us more and more to get less and less. And that's from fossil fuel I'm talking about. Another rule is all fossil fuel, all extraction from the skin of the earth, mining, drilling, mining somehow, taking resources out of the skin of the earth, gets more expensive over time. Simply because we always, as humans, pick the easy fruit first. The tough fruit comes later, it gets more expensive. All renewable resources get cheaper over time because we get better, we get more for less input. And there's no cost to the renewable. It happens anyway, and it's always there. So the rule, this is an economic rule that certainly parts of the American financial system and investment system recognizes, because I first read this in a financial report that was prepared for investors about should they invest in China over the next 10 years. That was the subject. But in it, they made this very long, structured assessment that all extraction industries get more expensive, all renewables get cheaper over time, and if we solve the storage problem, we could approach energy costs to near zero, except for the cost of simply producing the physical gizmo, solar panel, wind generator. After that, the energy is there. The sun shines, the wind blows. And that over time, if we can learn to store it, we can make the relative cost of energy drop to near zero. Now, this article didn't go on, but again, from my readings of Greer and other economic, if we make the cost of energy in the whole economic equation of capitalism near zero, it also screws things up. We're still going to have to learn to live another way. But we certainly are seeing a point where we have to produce it different, use it different, and we're going to be suffering under a regime where energy becomes much more difficult to get or costly than it used to be. And that's why this whole wonderful world we live in, the Western world of goodies, this incredible chip camera compared to my old great big thing, this GoPro. The reason we can do all of that is because energy's been relatively available and relatively cheap. And that's going to end. And it's all tied to climate. That's why it all fits in here. If we're going to solve the climate problem, we better solve how we make and use energy, which is a total different economic issue.
So true. I wanted to maybe leave one thing. Someone watching this right now, they're like, I don't believe you. What would you tell them to have them move forward in a journey that leads them to the truth?
That is such a good question. Good because it's so difficult to answer. Certainly that person would have to consciously seek out a variety of sources of information. We have media outlets that are biased in the sense they are making, I assume, business decisions, among others, to speak only from one side of the topic or the other. And of course, I'm thinking of Fox News and Breitbart and some others. But I have seen, without telling you the whole story, I've had personal experiences right here in this neighborhood and all over this county of people who have said to me, and I've witnessed it, they listen to nothing other than a single news source. And they don't accept any other news source of any kind. And they accept what they hear as truth and deny even that which they don't read or don't expose them to as being false. And then I think there are a lot of people that way. It starts with the motive of accepting that, gosh, some of this makes sense and maybe we're really cooking ourselves here, and maybe we're really screwing things for my grandkids. I got grandkids and I worry about, maybe I really, well, they're going to have to expose themselves to some other ideas. It's a big part of the population that doesn't have much appreciation for science and that science can learn things. Now, that's part of my religious statement a minute ago. What did God do to make us really special? Well, He gave us thumbs. It's the best tool ever, yes I am, the best tool ever made. We make all the others. And we have a brain that can learn things. I mean, what did God really say to us? Somewhere in the Bible it says this. I know it did. I was brought up in the church. It says that we have a consciousness and we have ability to ask a question and then come up with answers. We can learn. Science is a process of humans really applying one of their greatest God-given gifts, and that is to learn. To ask a question that I don't know. Oh, I could figure it out if I do it this way. If I ask my question in parts, I can come up with the answers. A lot of Americans, others, don't accept science as a method of learning. I don't know why. I think because they weren't exposed. I grew up with a scientist. You know, I went to a high school that was well funded. I had physics and chemistry. Did lousy in chemistry, better in physics. Terrible in math. But we need some exposure to the ability of science to actually come up with truth and mean something so that we can learn. And then we have to go about, and those of us who aren't doing the research, we have to read, but we have to have a belief in science. I think there are a lot of folks who do not believe that science can know what the climate was 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. In this climate debate, that's critical. To believe that, well, the ice cores show this, and it's real. A lot of people don't believe that that's real because we really can't do that. Now, I don't know why they don't believe that. Again, I grew up in a science family and had a modicum of science exposure in school. So I don't know. I am afraid, as I've already expressed, that maybe we don't succeed in getting people, a critical mass of people, to think otherwise, to think that climate is a threat, et cetera, et cetera. We don't succeed in that. And then I think they will only move on the basis of catastrophe. Not only does Miami flood in the surge of a big hurricane 10 years from now, it actually doesn't drain away. I mean, Miami's problem is it sits on porous geology. When Miami floods, it's going to be from the ground up. And we will, in fact, and I think Miami's kind of a place for this because of this porous ground underneath, where a storm surge, Miami's fine. I mean, everybody sees the oceans rising, they're kind of worried, but they still don't believe it. Big, massive hurricane comes in, floods the whole city, does a lot of other damage too, but the water doesn't leave. There is no future to go back to. I think it'll be that kind of catastrophe before we move the reticent brains. That's not very hopeful. My John Michael Greer, the historian, very difficult to read. There aren't many answers, and he's not very hopeful. He doesn't think we're falling off a cliff. He talks about the long decline, the slow, long decline, that we're going to face this restriction in energy, and it's going to be a rugged period sorting that out. And he seems to imply we're stupid enough we won't see it coming, and Miami will flood first before we move.
What would it take to change your mind about this topic, that climate change isn't happening and isn't man-made? What would it take?
Well, I guess it would take a decade or more. It would take a period of time where the weather and the climate actually proved to me that it was going otherwise. In weather, we generally think it takes in the weather business, 3 decades to identify, just to begin to first identify a trend, a change, a shift in a new direction. I think it would take several decades of planetary cold, not just in the eastern US. After all, it's called global warming. Eastern US, I heard this 2 years ago with the big cold winter in the east. There's congressman saying, right on the floor of Congress, it's so cold in my hometown in Virginia. How can you talk about warming? It's called global warming. The planet was warming up all around us at the time that happened. I think it would take a couple of decades of planetary cold, meaning shifting to the cold side of normal. Now, just to measure that, I mean, here's a measure of the change. In the month of February, the kind of change it would take to change my mind. In the month of February, there were 6,200 plus, I'll quote that much, 6,200 new high temperature records in the United States alone in the month of February. There were 95 new cold temperature records. I would want to see a shift in the actual recorded weather over a period of more than a decade that shifted it to a huge dominance of cold temperature records versus high temperature records. And the only other thing that would do it, and actually the other thing would do it first, it would still take a couple decades. I'd want to see the amount of terrestrial, that is based on land, not on the water, ice. I would want to see the glaciers in the mountains across the entire globe all growing for 20 years before I'd start scratching my head and saying, well, maybe the CO2 in the atmosphere doesn't do what I thought it did. Ice is the measure. I mean, you can't argue with it. Everybody has this good sense in their head. It's either cold enough to freeze water or it's not. If you cross this line somewhere around 32 degrees, you go from liquid to solid. We're losing ice on the planet. For the last 60 million years since the dinosaurs were here, we've been primarily an ice planet. More years in temperatures that were almost too cold for humans to live. To these interglacial periods where it gets warm enough that we have this kind of experience, we're living in the current interglacial warm period. All of human civilization has come to rise during that period. Interglacial warm period right now is roughly 12,000 years old. Human civilization roughly 7,000 years old. During that whole time, we've been abnormal for the planet Earth. The planet Earth has mostly been glaciers over long periods of time, going back to the dinosaurs, an ice planet. Now we've enjoyed this beautiful warmth again. Humans came to be, and we've seen that the amount of ice on the land is diminishing. We're losing the land-based glaciers. I say land-based because they're so critical in the actual, as a good measure. There's a lot of other things affecting ocean ice. But land-based ice is disappearing. I'd want to see 2 decades of land-based ice growing significantly before I'd say, maybe I was wrong. Otherwise, the ice is melting. We're getting warmer. I can't change my mind. We're losing ice on the planet. Grand Traverse Bay, 700 yards from where we're sitting right now, has one of the longest ice-in, ice-out records in the world. Every climate researcher in the world knows the ice-in, ice-out record of Grand Traverse Bay. It goes back to 1850. In the first year, 1850 to 51, there was no ice. And I've always asked myself, why did somebody start an ice record when there was no ice? Well, these were early, still some French, certainly British explorers. Well, they'd explored the region, but early penetrators of the wilderness, as far back in 1850. And everything they knew from the past was Grand Traverse Bay always froze, every year. From the bay out to the island, that's how the record is kept. 1851, there was no ice. Well, why would you start the record? Because it was so weird. There was no ice. For the next 13 decades, 130 years, Grand Traverse Bay froze 7, 8, 9, or 10 years out of every decade. In fact, most of them were 8, 9, and 10 years out of every decade. And there were several decades, there were one pair where it was 10 years back to back, every year, through 2 decades. We have now gone through, I'll have to be careful here, since I haven't looked. We went through a 10-year period. Well, since 1980, we went the next 10 years, 3 years froze. 90 to 2000, 2 years froze. 2000 to 2010, 1 year. Now it's not natural for Grand Traverse Bay to freeze, but it used to be. Now, if I saw Grand Traverse Bay freeze 10 years in a row, no, that would do it. If I saw Grand Traverse Bay now freeze 10 years in a row, and I saw other indications around the planet, it's global, that were showing the same cold, I'd start changing my mind. Ain't gonna happen. We got too much of a blanket around the planet. We're heating it up. There's no way around it. It's simple. Again, I can go back to a high school physics classroom. And with the assistance of the physics teacher, we could show that in a lab in high school, what's happening. And the proof, again, that it's happening is ice. We're losing ice on the planet. Water's either cold enough to stay ice, or it warms up and it turns to water. We're turning ice to water. We're getting warmer.
Yeah, there's a beautiful documentary that I'll recommend to leave you with.
Chasing Ice.
There it is, yeah.
If you haven't seen Chasing Ice, go find it.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No. I mean, no.
I really appreciate you meeting with me, though.
Oh, it's been fun.
And speaking with me, yeah.
It's been fun.
I agree. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to episode 8 of the Belief Books podcast. And thank you so much to Dave Barrons, who was awesome enough to have me stay over with him and his wife, and for being a guest on the podcast. I really value our conversation during the interview, as well as the ones we had after in the evening and over breakfast. But I hope you also gained a lot from it too. So, if you did, please leave a review for me on iTunes, or leave a message on Facebook, connect with me on Twitter, or on Instagram, and directly on the website where you can listen to more episodes and comment on them directly. You can also find me on the Theology Corner Network, which is a network of theological-themed blogs and podcasts. You can check out my page on there at theologycorner.net/thebeliefbooks. You can pretty much find me anywhere searching The Belief Books. But no matter where you find me or if you find me, I just hope you keep the conversation going. Let people know about this one. I'll see you on the next episode of The Belief Books.
Hot damn. That was a great conversation.